All right, hi. My name is Dante Bazard. I am the manager of anti-racism initiatives with the Executive Council Office and the Anti-Racism Office. And I first came to PEI in 2011, where I studied psychology at UPEI. And I'm from the Bahamas, Nassau, Bahamas. I graduated in 2016. Yeah. It's been a while. It's been a while. What's funny is because I did my master's degree in the University of Leicester in the UK, right? And I didn't immediately come back to Canada. Well, I didn't immediately come back to PEI. I went to Brampton first, and it was very difficult finding jobs in my area because I did my master's degree in clinical criminology and my BA in psychology. And originally I wanted to go into like that psychology medical field, but there wasn't any options for me. And there were no like connections after I graduated to have any connections to the job market as a psychologist or in that area of work. So it was very difficult. So I didn't even work in that field when I graduated from my master's degree. I started off as a loss prevention officer, which is a glorified term as a security guard basically for a high-end clothing store. And I had a master's degree. Yeah, so it was an uphill battle. Yeah, it was not easy. It was not fun. So some of the challenges that I faced when I moved back to Brampton was that I had no connections there. I didn't have anyone to tell me, well, this is, the places you can apply. This is some of the areas you can look into and things like that. So it was really starting off with like ground zero with no knowledge. And then on top of that too is that there's not really any knowledge of services as well. So I came in to Brampton and I didn't know any like what were the like websites or things like that to look at. That was really, really challenging in itself. And then on top of that too, even preparing for the job market, right? So even in terms of going for like interviews and things like that. Like how do you conduct the interview? Like how do you answer questions correctly and things like that? It's just really you're just swimming, right? Like in a vast ocean, and you don't know like what you're doing. Just hoping you're hitting just like the right points to get what you need to get to the next step, basically. Yeah. So then when I moved to PEI, it was the same challenge as well too, because the first job I got was at as a client service representative for the U.S. side, which it was not a fun job at all. It was the same thing again though. So I came back to PEI, which I knew some people here. I graduated from UPEI, but again, I didn't have any avenues to tell me like where to apply, what jobs to get, and then there's also the scarcity as well too. Even looking at like Indeed and things like that, there weren't jobs in my field of study. And particularly in psychology, as you may also know, is that you really can't get a decent paying job unless you have a PhD. Right? So that's the other like challenge of it too. So you're not really paid your worth, and then on top of that too, you're put into positions where you can't. There's limited upward mobility as well too. Yeah, I think for me, the Canadian experience wasn't that much of a huge factor just because I studied my BA in psychology in Canada and then I got my master's in the University of Leicester in the UK. And I feel like a lot of, especially in this hemisphere of the world, they would value those kind of degrees. What came more so for me when it comes to the Canadian experience is more so of like the interview process, things like that, because I feel like there's a cultural barrier when it comes to the communication. And during those conversations, those interviews, I could tell that they had a different standard, or they're looking for certain answers, or you have to answer a question a certain way, or you have to speak a certain way as well too. And I felt that was a huge barrier for me personally. But I do know that for a lot of persons who are looking for jobs in the Canadian job market, that you do struggle with having to find that Canadian experience, because if you move over here and you don't have any of that Canadian experience, they're looking for that. They do judge you for not having a degree that came from Canada or having a job experiences from Canada. 100%, especially when I worked in the field. So my first experience with like in the psychology field was working in group homes, and I experienced a lot of racism in group homes. Racism from staff, racism from they call it clients or our patients, depending on where you work. And that was a huge factor. And even in terms of upward mobility, so I had experience where it was well known. So I worked at a mental hospital, and it was known that our patients were very fond of like myself, the work that I did with them, and I had a good relationship with them. But despite that, they would always promote persons who were usually the white male over persons who had a connection with the client. And they weren't good at their job either, but they still got the promotions, and we all knew why. So that was always a factor as well too. So yeah, I mean, upward mobility, getting promotions, and just getting opportunities are impacted by your race in Canada. I can't really point to like, because with the job interviews, it's not that they would sure just call it like a slur during the interview. It'd be more of like microaggressions, asking you questions to assess your competence in an area when you clearly have it because you have the degree, but they know that you're from a different country and they don't know if you have the same competence like Canadian candidate would. So they would kind of use some questions kind of weed that out, but a lot of those questions are based off of microaggressions. But in terms of like in the job, I know one example was that in a children's group home, there was this kid in particular who always used the N-word whenever I was in working with them. And then when I told my supervisor and other staff about it, they said, well, they don't even know what the term means, and they use the term for like other people who aren't black as well, so I should be fine with it. And I just had to deal with that. That was my work environment. So every time I go in there, like I would be called N-word like multiple times, and they would do nothing about it. And then there was another occasion where what they also do too is that because your first language may not be English or they don't think that it is, they do a lot of things where, so for example, when I was working in a group home too, you had to put in your hours to get paid. And I had instances where the next day after I put in my hours, the next day I would come into work, I would notice that they would change the hours to make it less. And you wouldn't know unless you checked it. So that's why sometimes your paycheck would come up short too. Well, you dehumanize number one, right? Because there's basic human rights. Being a human being, you feel you should be entitled to certain things. Not things where it's like it's mandatory. It's more so of like your basic needs, right? So if you're in a workplace, that their basic needs are A, you should be respected. B, there should be some level of trust, and then like you said before, there should be a level of accountability of some things go sideways, right? Or there's issues in the workplace, and those needs just were not met in a lot of the workspaces I've been in, for the most part, really. Yeah, so then after I decided I want to get out of the mental health field and went into like advocacy and human rights and community work. The other part of it is that a lot of persons recognize like, yeah, you've built up your expertise in this field, and they even call you the expert in this field, like the expert in anti-racism, expert in EDI, and that kind of thing. But then you start to work in institutions, and then the behavior doesn't follow. So you're an expert, but then you make a recommendation and it's not taken seriously because you're making the recommendation, or that other person in the room who don't look like you are disagreeing with you, and all of a sudden you're not the expert anymore. That happens a lot too in other industries I've been in, other institutions, whether it be universities, government, arm's length organizations from government, same thing. I mean, there's been a lot of collaboration and a lot of respect in those areas as well too, depending on who you can connect with. But there's other internal issues that exacerbate it, because, for example, government, you tend to work in silos a lot. There's a lot of communication, and that can cause issues to begin with. And then you couple that with microaggressions and racism, then you just have a recipe for disaster. So it's kind of like existing issues that are further exacerbated by the presence of racism and microaggression. When I hear that, it's very personal for me because, you know, I was the first Black Human Rights Commissioner in PEI. I was the first, I might have been, I'm pretty sure I was the first Black person in the Executive Council office, maybe. I was the first Black person to be doing anti-racism work in government in PEI. There was a lot of spaces where I was the only Black person, and it's currently still the only Black person in the room, and I had to be the loudest in the room, and so I had to push the work being the only person carrying it in the room. That with itself comes with a lot of stress, a lot of expectations, and when you get pushed back on that too at the same time, when you're still like the only person doing it and carrying it, all that weight on your shoulder, it's a huge toll. Because a lot of people don't speak about when they're having these conversations about the mental toll on it as well too, and it's a lot. Yeah. Yeah. When you start a new job, right? The first feeling you have, you walking through the doors, you're very excited because it's something new. You have like opportunities to show, you know, your skills, what you can do, and typically, you know, persons who are very excited about the job they're taking, especially if this is their passion, they want to do a very good job. I had that as well too going in, and I feel that when you go in these spaces where you're the only person who's allowed in the room or the person who has to push work forward with very minimal support or resources, it wears you down and it burns you out as well too. There's a lot of burnout in the area of anti-racism EDI across the board. And when I talk to my other colleagues across Canada, they're facing the same thing. Because I remember I had a conversation with one of my colleagues who used to work with IRCC federally, and she told me that the lifespan for persons who work in anti-racism space is 3 years. After that, you usually move on to something else because you burn out. And I am 2.5 years in. So. I mean, for me, like, I always tell people too, for me personally, I am an immigrant, right? For the most part, like, I'm now a Canadian citizen, but I'm from the Bahamas. Came here as an international student. I am used to going from place to place to find where I can fit in and thrive. If I'm not in a space where I can be respected and thrive, then I just move on to the next thing. I mean, it's great when you can, you know, establish like great things, like, you know, like the anti-racism office, do the work I've been doing, that kind of stuff is good. But at the end of the day, you know, persons, it can't always just be like a take relationship. In my opinion, it has to be a very reciprocal relationship. It's like, yes, as a person who represents the community, as an advocate, you have to kind of be in a position where you have to be, you know, selfless in a way to work for the community, but then at the same time, you're also a part of that community. So how does your cup, like, how do you fill your cup while doing this work at the same time? No. I mean, because even if you think about, like, okay, let's think about the steps, right? You experience microaggression racism. What's next? Right? What's the process? Who do I report to? When I do report to someone, what are the next steps after that? Then after that, what's the accountability process look like? Is there a follow-up? How are there measures that can be put in place to ensure that it won't happen again, or at least mitigate it at the very best, right? None of that happened. Most of the times when I report racism in the workplace, in all the workplaces I've worked in, I have been either given weirdly a high five for reporting and then that's it, or they would say that, well, it wasn't that X, Y, Z. They try to like kind of downplay it, and then in the worst case scenario, because the position I'm in, they'll tell me to figure out the process and make it so that other people who experience it don't have to go through it, which I do because that's a part of my job, right? But at the same time, it's like, but what about me, right? Because I've experienced it first, and this is an opportunity for you to. Because again, the other part of it is that you can't just put it on the one person or the one community or group member or group organization to do this work. It's a whole collective. They come from many different sources. I mean, because thinking about it in different contexts as well too, in terms of if you if your commitment to the communities that you say that you're committed to serve, right? There's also accountability of, okay, well, you didn't have to be ready to hear what that community has to say, and then you have to be ready to act on what they are saying as well too. I mean, there is like collaborative and back and forth, but at the end of the day, if you say that you're committed to the XYZ community, they tell you that you should do this to address these issues, and then your response to that is, well, we can't do that right now because this is how the process is right now, or we're not willing to change certain systems in order to accommodate that, then that's a lack of accountability in that way. The other accountability is, what are your accountability to your employees, right? You're not, if you have employees who are represented by marginalized communities, then you need to have a process in place so that they ensure that they can thrive, right? Because you can't just say that, well, we are a very welcoming and inclusive environment, and then that's it. That's just words. Where's the action? Where's the policy? Where is the actual like commitment, right? Can you if someone sat you down and asked you, can you demonstrate your commitment to the BIPOC community in your organization? Can you do that meaningfully? Not through like the performative stuff that we see from time to time. I mean, like, can you actually show it through numbers? Can you show it through disaggregated data? Can you show it through anecdotal evidence from your employees who are BIPOC? Without, you have to also consider power imbalances as well too, because a lot of times when the people who are answering these questions are like the head of the organizations, and they're actually their employees, and they're just saying like, because you have to, right? It's a paycheck at the end of the day too. So I mean, the accountability is that you are accountable for the people that you make a commitment to. You're accountable for their safety. You're accountable for their upper mobility as well too. It's not just on them to have that tenacity to be like, yeah, I want to work hard, yes, but at the same time, if there's those barriers, then that hard work is just going nowhere. Yeah, well, the first thing is being an advocate on the inside, right? That's number one. Is that when I notice there's these gaps and barriers in these policies. So, for example, well, I don't know if I can shut up. Well, so for example, with like certain policies, like a lot of organizations have like harassment policies, things like that, right? So, for example, like I would go in, review those policies, notice where there are gaps in terms of if there's a lack of definitions, if you're not defining racism, for example, in that policy, then I go in there and say, look, this is the definition you can use, this is the impact it can have, and you can update the policy that way. That has been done internally, and that's one way that we've been able to do that. The other way is that providing tools and resources to departments and just organizations. So we have, for example, like the standard demographic survey, because as you may know, disaggregated data, the collection of disaggregated data is virtually non-existent in PEI, besides collecting for like census, for example. But we need to be making policy-informed decisions. So we created a document that had data sets to collect disaggregated data, as well as potential safeguards in order to make sure that we're not continue to perpetrate racism through collecting data as well too. So we have that for government now. There's also been just collaboration with other departments, education as well too, because there's a lot of EDI positions now that are popping up in different departments as well. And a lot of that work has been driven from like the anti-racism office, but in collaboration with those departments. But again, I think that's something to speak to with just even your presence, being in certain spaces and being who you are, also impacts change without you have to lift a finger. Because if there hasn't been a black person in a certain space and now there is, that impacts change. So that's the other part of it too. Yeah, I think just across the board, there needs to be a change in how we do things in terms of just even interviews, job postings, and things like that. For example, in the past before when we were looking at jobs, they wouldn't. There were some postings that wouldn't even show the salary, right? Like on their job posting website, but now they're required to do so. So things like that, like being more anytime there's a process that's more transparent, it helps our marginalized communities. For our interviews, there's different way of doing interviews, even for like blind interviews too, or even blind choosing candidates. Because we know, for example, if you have a certain last name or your name sounds a certain way, then you're less likely to be chosen for interview. So if we can implement those kind of changes to ensure that persons are given an equitable chance to gain those interviews, that's a win. The other thing is too, is just again, just having clear processes as well too. So then once they're in the workplace, how are we ensuring that they're going to thrive in the workplace? Are they supported? Do they have resources? If the answer is no, then how are we going to do that, right? So, for example, if you're establishing an EDI office or an EDI position, ensure that they're well funded, right? Like, I mean, why is it any different than any other position in any other department? Because if we're talking about something else, then it's like, oh yeah, we got to put X amount of $1 million to that. But then all of a sudden we're talking about marginalized communities, then the numbers keep shrinking, getting smaller. We're seeing that across the board, even bringing the states into this. They're shutting down all the EDI offices across different universities. How are we strengthening our EDI offices so that the same thing doesn't happen in Canada, right? So it's things like that. And then also going back to process again, once they're in there, they experience racism. Is the process clear? Is the process streamlined? Is the same thing across the board where they're going? The accountability process, the accountability factors again. It's just having these processes in place and being meaningful, and when you're engaging with BIPOC communities in order to build these processes, center their voices at the end of the day, because you have these meetings, collaboration, things like that, and what happens is that they go back to their offices and then they're centering their voices into the process, and then it doesn't impact the BIPOC community. It doesn't make any sense. If you bring us in and say that we're experts or that we have all this knowledge and you want to use that knowledge to influence the process, then do that. Don't bring us in and then don't make the change. It doesn't make any sense. It's gaslighting. Textbook gaslighting. I mean, and it's a double-edged sword, right? Because then they'll be like, well, we need, especially for organizations that have low diversity, right? Because that's the other thing too. Because then if you're being interviewed for a position and then none of our interviewers, are identifying with you, then it's already harder, right? And even this, and especially in my case too, is where I wrote the position for the answer policy advisor, and I still had to interview for it, and there's no one on the panel who understands the position, because the position was never created before. So then how do you curb something like that, right? And again, I feel like going back to the term isolation, there should be more collaboration between provinces, right? So if we have someone, for example, who's in another province, like say Nova Scotia, who may have more experience, we can bring them in just like as a consultant to do that hiring process, then they should do that, right? But they don't do that, as far as I know. I would say try to connect with as much persons as possible in the space that you're interested in working in. Especially with a place like PEI, it's a lot about like who you know at the same time too, in order to like get opportunities or get connected to opportunities, I would say. And I mean, connecting to organizations like ASDA, because again, there's different steps to the process. So if you need help with your resume or understanding the interview process or how to conduct interviews, or I mean, do the interviews that you're being invited to, then you need like organizations like this who help with those skills building. And I would encourage, I mean, a lot of times, you see by one person certain spaces you think they're like unreachable, but I feel like in PI, a lot of persons are very reachable. I would encourage them like to reach out to them, even like to myself, for example, to understand like the job market, some of the challenges, and having like these kind of conversations. Because again, a lot of people are going into this space and they just don't know or aren't ready or prepared, don't know how to navigate the space. You know, so just like not gatekeeping information. Yeah. No, I think that having these conversations are always very important from time to time. As the industries change, job market changes, and I think this conversation needs to continue from time to time as things progress. Especially when you see certain policies that are being passed, like the international student cap and things like that, and how that would influence, the job market or even persons who are hiring and things like that too. It's always good to have these conversations, have this kind of information, then given back to the community so that they can start even thinking about these things, because there might be persons who are in their last year of university and never thought about these things before, or who may be in psychology right now. If you're in psychology, please think about it. If you want to do a PhD. If you're not, then you have to really think of what your next job is going to be, because nobody told me that. That was a real shock to me. But no, yeah, it's no, it's good. It's good to have this conversation, stay connected, and yeah, just it's hard out there. It's hard out there, and just want people just to be encouraged and just keep moving forward.